hmm All right, A pushers. This is the first part of chapter 11. The title of chapter 11 is Religion and Reform, and it focuses on the time period between 1800 and 1860. As always, while reading, I want you to consider this big idea question, which is to what extent did individualism, new religious sects, abolitionism, and women's rights, as far as the movement was called in the 19th century, change American culture between 1820 and 1860. So again, it focuses on the changes in American culture that were brought about by that concept of individualism, new religious denominations, the concept of abolitionism, and women's rights. There are four different sections to Chapter 11. I'm going to go ahead and focus on sections 1 and 2 in this broadcast, which are individualism, the ethic of the middle class, where we'll focus on Ralph Waldo Emerson and transcendentalism, as well as Emerson's literary influence. The second part of it is rural communalism and urban pop culture, which is the utopian impulse, Joseph Smith and the Mormon experience, and urban popular culture. So here we go. Here's the intro to Chapter 11. The spirit of reform is in every place, declared the children of legal reformer David Dudley Field in their handwritten monthly Gazette in 1842. It reads, "The laborer with a family says, reform the common schools. The merchant and the planter say, reform the tariff. The lawyer, reform the laws. The politician, reform the government. The abolitionist, reform the slave laws. The moralist, reform intemperance. The ladies wish their legal privileges extended, and in short, the whole country is wanting reform." That could be, you could draw connections to our modern day society in the United States today in 2016. Continuing on page 344, like many Americans, the Field children sensed that the political whirlwind of the 1830s had transformed the way people thought about themselves and about society. Suddenly, thousands of men and women took inspiration from the economic progress and democratic spirit of the age. Drawing on the religious optimism of the Second Great Awakening, they felt that they could improve their personal lives and society as a whole. Some activists dedicated themselves to the cause of reform. William Lloyd Garrison began as an anti-slavery advocate and foe of Indian removal, and then went on to campaign for women's rights, pacifism, and the abolition of prisons. Susan B. Anthony embraced anti-slavery, temperance, and female suffrage. Such obsessively reform-minded individuals, warned Unitarian minister Henry W. Bellows, were pursuing an object which in its very nature is unattainable, the perpetual improvement of people's outward condition. In Bellows' view, human progress depended on inner character, the regeneration of man through Christian precepts. Such debates reveal the multifaceted character of the reform impulse. Like Bellows, the first wave of American reformers, the benevolent religious improvers of the 1820s, hoped to promote morality and enforce social discipline. They championed regular church attendance, temperance, and a strict moral code. Their zeal offended many upright citizens. A peaceable man can hardly venture to eat or drink, to correct his child or kiss his wife without obtaining the permission of some moral or other reformed society, said one. A second wave of reformers, Garrison, Anthony, and other activists of the 1830s and 1840s, undertook to liberate people from archaic customs and traditional lifestyles. Mostly middle-class Northerners and Midwesterners, these activists promoted a bewildering assortment of radical ideals: extreme individualism, common ownership of property, the immediate emancipation of slaves, and sexual equality. Although the numbers were small, second-wave reformers challenged deeply rooted cultural practices and elicited horrified opposition among the majority of Americans. As one fearful Southerner saw it, radical reformers favored a chaotic world with no marriage, no religion, no private property, no law, and no government. With this, I can't pause at this point in time, but I need to go get my bottle of water. So hang out for just a couple of seconds and I will return in just a moment. Nothing quite like a refreshing glass of water. I'm sitting in my hotel room in Denver recording this for you right now, still trying to get warm from that terrible Broncos-Patriots game. Yes, Steven, I know, the Patriots won. A couple of things that I want you to keep in mind in regards to this. It's a historical thinking skill focusing on synthesis. You should analyze the relationship between literature and history in this section, and keep this in mind. To what extent does literature provide insights about the historical context in a given time? What are the advantages and limitations of literature as a source for understanding a time period? So keep in mind all of those pieces of literature that your English teachers ask you to read, what they're trying to do, not only to teach you literary devices and whatnot, but it helps you to understand how we can gain information about history based off of that. So I want you to think about the influence of European Enlightenment ideals in the early 18th century and how those ideas led to a questioning of traditional Puritan values. And that's going to lead us into the time period of Romanticism, as we've already discussed, and the emergence of Transcendentalism, which is what we're going to discuss at this point in time. So we're on page 346, and to try and keep you engaged as you're listening, I'm going to utilize different accents as requested by the students in 8A. So we're going to start out with individualism, the ethic of the middle class. Those fears were not exaggerated. Rapid economic growth and geographical expansion had weakened traditional institutions, forcing individuals to fend for themselves. In 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville coined the term individualism to describe the result. Native-born white Americans were no longer attached to each other by any tie of caste, class, association, or family, the French aristocrat lamented, and so lived in social isolation. As Tocqueville mourned the loss of social ties, the New England essayist and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, born in 1803 and died in 1882, celebrated the liberation of the individual. Emerson's vision influenced thousands of ordinary Americans and a generation of important artists who, in the American Renaissance, a vocabulary term you need to know, a mid-19th century flourishing of literature and philosophy, wrote a remarkable number of first-class novels, poems, and essays. Ralph Waldo Emerson is someone that you do need to make sure that you're paying close attention to and making sure that you make notes about within the notes that you take. So this time we're going to focus on Mr. Emerson and Transcendentalism. Emerson was the leading voice of Transcendentalism, an intellectual movement rooted in the religious soil of New England. Now, I just gave you a brief description of what Transcendentalism means. You're going to have to do a little bit more digging to get a better definition of Transcendentalism. Its first advocates were Unitarian ministers from well-to-do New England families who questioned the constraints of their Puritan heritage, as we discussed in Chapter 8. For inspiration, they turned to European Romanticism, a new concept of self and society. Romantic thinkers such as German philosopher Immanuel Kant and English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge rejected the ordered, rational world of the 18th century Enlightenment. They embraced human passion and sought deeper insight into the mysteries of existence. By tapping their intuitive powers, the young Unitarians believed people could come to know the infinite and the eternal. As a Unitarian, Emerson stood outside the mainstream of American Protestantism. Unlike most Christians, Unitarians believed that God was a single being, not a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In 1832, Emerson took a more radical step by resigning his Boston pulpit and rejecting all organized religion. He moved to Concord, Massachusetts, and wrote influential essays probing what he called the infinitude of the private man, the radically free person. The young philosopher argued that people were trapped by inherent customs and institutions. They wore the ideas of earlier times. New England Calvinism, for example, as a kind of faded masquerade, and they needed to shed those values. What is a man born for I'll start over again. Here's a direct quote. What is a man born for but to be a reformer, a remaker of what man has made? Emerson asked. In his view, individuals could be remade only by discovering their original relation with nature and entering into a mystical union with the currents of universal being. So nature is obviously going to be one of those big concepts under transcendentalism. The ideal setting for this transcendent discovery was under an open sky in solitary communion with nature. The revivalist Charles Grandison Finney described the religious conversion in Emersonian terms: an individual in the woods, alone, joining with God in a mystical union. The transcendentalist message of individual self-realization reached hundreds of thousands of people through Emerson's writings and lectures. Public lectures have become a spectacularly successful way of spreading the information and fostering discussion among the middle classes. Beginning in 1826, the Lyceum movement, another vocabulary term you'll need to know, Lyceum, modeled on the public forum of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, arranged lecture tours by hundreds of poets, preachers, scientists, and reformers. The Lyceum became an important cultural institution in the North and Midwest, but not in the South, where the middle class was smaller and popular education had a lower priority. In 1839, nearly 150 Lyceums in Massachusetts invited lecturers to address more than 33,000 subscribers. Emerson was the most popular speaker, eventually delivering 1,500 lectures in more than 300 towns in 20 states. Emerson celebrated those who rejected tradition and practiced self-discipline and civic responsibility. His individualistic ethos spoke directly to the experiences of many middle-class Americans who had left family farms to make their way in the urban world. His pantheistic, I believe that's how you say it, Pantheistic, I'd look that up if I were you, his pantheistic view of nature, though that it was saturated with the presence of God, encouraged Unitarian, I'll try that again, encouraged Unitarians in Boston to create the Mount Auburn Cemetery, a beautiful planned landscape of trees and bushes and burial markers for the dead of all faiths. Soon there were similar rural cemeteries in many American cities, so this is the birth of the American cemetery. Emerson's optimism also inspired many religious preachers of the Second Great Awakening, such as Finney, who told believers to transcend old doctrines and constraints. Quote, "God has made man a moral free agent," end quote, Finney declared. Emerson worried that the new market society, the focus on work, profits, and consumption, was debasing American spiritual lives. "Things are in the saddle," he wrote, "and red mankind." Seeking to revive intellectual life, Transcendentalists created communal experiments. The most important was Brook Farm, and in your notes you need to make sure that you emphasize Brook Farm, just outside Boston, where Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller were residents or frequent visitors. Members recalled that they inspired the young with a passion for study, and the middle-aged with deference and admiration. Whatever its intellectual excitement and spiritual rewards, Brook Farm was an economic failure. The residents planned to produce their own food and exchange their surplus milk, vegetables, and hay for manufacturers. However, most members were ministers, teachers, writers, and students who had few farming skills. Only the cash of affluent residents kept the enterprise afloat for 5 years. After a devastating fire in 1846, the organizers disbanded the community and sold the farm. With the failure of Brook Farm, the Emersonians abandoned their quest for new social institutions. They accepted the brute reality of the emergent commercial and industrial order and tried to reform it, especially through the education of workers and the movement to abolish slavery. So let's take a look at Emerson's literary influence. But before we do that, I want you to think about this question. What were the main principles of Transcendentalism? Make sure you have those noted in your notes. And how did they differ from the beliefs of most Protestant Christians? So you might keep in mind continuity and change over time there. So Emerson's literary influence. Even as Emerson urged his fellow citizens to break free from tradition and expand their spiritual awareness, he issued a declaration of literary independence. In The American Scholar, published in 1837, Emerson urged American authors to free themselves from the courtly muse of old Europe and find inspiration in the experiences of ordinary Americans. Quote, "The ballad in the street, the news of the boat, the glance of the eye, the foam and gait of the body," end quote. So now we're going to take a look at Thoreau, Fuller, and Whitman. One young New England intellectual, Henry David Thoreau, born in 1817, died in 1862, heeded Emerson's call and sought inspiration from the natural world. In 1845, depressed by his beloved brother's death, Thoreau built a cabin near Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and lived alone there for 2 years. In 1854, he published Walden, or Life in the Woods, an account of his search for meaning beyond the artificiality of civilized society. Here's just a little quote from his literary work. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Walden's most famous metaphor provides an enduring justification for independent thinking. Quote, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drama. End quote. Beginning from this premise, Thoreau advocated a thoroughgoing individuality, urging readers to avoid unthinking conformity to social norms and peacefully to resist unjust laws. As Thoreau was seeking self-realization for men, Margaret Fuller, born in 1810, died in 1850, was exploring the possibilities of freedom for women. Born into a wealthy Boston family, Fuller mastered 6 languages and read broadly in classic literature. Embracing Emerson's ideals, she started a transcendental conversation or discussion group for educated Boston women in 1839. While editing The Dial, the leading transcendentalist journal, Fuller published Woman in the 19th Century. 1844 is when it was published. So I'm going to ask you to compare Thoreau's idea of individual civil disobedience with the doctrine of nullification outlined in Calhoun's South Carolina Exposition and Protest, as you read about in Chapter 10. What were the different contexts in which the two sets of principles emerged? Was one more justifiable than the other? If so, why? So again, you're comparing Thoreau's idea of individual civil disobedience with the doctrine of nullification outlined in Calhoun's South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Both were protests, and both were kind of somewhat along the line of individualism, even though the nullification crisis was just not one person. Couple of other things to keep in mind to help you visualize the influence of Emersonian ideals in the 19th century US. You might compare the images of the Mount Auburn Cemetery with images of older cemeteries in Boston, and those are available as part of a larger National Park Service teacher's lesson, of course, called Mount Auburn Cemetery, A New American Landscape. Just type into Google Mount Auburn Cemetery, A New American Landscape. And with that, I want you to think about these questions. What differences do you see? And how do these differences illustrate changing views of the relationship between man, God, and nature? Keep in mind Charles Grandison Finney. He was brought up in Chapter 9. And I want you to think about how he could be used to illustrate the influence of the Second Great Awakening and Romantic beliefs on the rise of voluntary reform organizations. All right, I'm going to take a break from the Southern accent. We are now on page 348, continuing on with Thoreau, Fuller, and Whitman. Margaret Fuller embraced the transcendental principle that all people could develop a life-affirming mystical relationship with God. Every woman, therefore, deserves psychological and social independence, the ability to grow as an intellect to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded. She wrote, quote, we would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down and every path laid open to woman as freely as to man, end quote. Fuller became the literary critic of the New York Tribune and traveled to Italy to report on the Revolution of 1848, only to drown in a shipwreck en route home to the United States. Fuller's life and writings inspired a rising generation of women writers and reformers. The poet Walt Whitman, born in 1819 and died in 1892, also responded to Emerson's call. He had been simmering, he recalled, and then Emerson brought me to a boil. Whitman worked as a printer, a teacher, a journalist, an editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, and an influential publicist for the Democratic Party. However, poetry was the direction of his dreams. In his most famous work, Leaves of Grass, which was a collection of wild, exuberant poems first published in 1855 and constantly revised and expanded, Whitman recorded in verse his efforts to transcend various invisible boundaries between solitude and community, between prose and poetry, even between the living and the dead. As the center of Leaves of Grass is the individual, quote, I, Walt, center of Leaves of Grass is the individual. Wow, I completely reread a sentence and that made no sense. Let me try that again. I, Walt, because, oh, goodness gracious, I, Walt. That's how he starts. He begins alone. Quote, I celebrate myself and sing myself, end quote. Because he has an Emersonian original relation with nature, Whitman claims perfect communion with others. Quote, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, end quote. For Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller, the individual had a divine spark. For Whitman, the collective democracy assumed a sacred character. Here's an interesting tidbit that's not referenced in your textbook. If you watched Breaking Bad at all, you will recall that a certain book, Leaves of Grass, was presented to Walter White. And ultimately, that is kind of what began to lead to his downfall in the last season of Breaking Bad, because there was something written within that kind of tipped his brother-in-law, who was in law enforcement, off. The Transcendentalists were optimistic but not naive. Whitman wrote about human suffering with passion, and Emerson laced his accounts of transcendence with twinges of anxiety. I am glad, he once said, to the brink of fear. Thoreau was gloomy about everyday life. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Nonetheless, dark murmurings remain muted in their work, overshadowed by assertions that nothing was impossible for the individual who could break free from tradition. Moving on to the subsection entitled Darker Visions on page 348. Emerson's writings also influenced two great novelists, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, who had more pessimistic worldviews. Both sounded powerful warnings that unfettered egoism could destroy individuals and those around them. Hawthorne brilliantly explored the theme of excessive individualism in his novel, The Scarlet Letter, in 1850. The two main characters, Hester Prynne and Arthur Dimmesdale, blatantly challenged their 17th century New England community by committing adultery and producing a child. Their decision to ignore social restraints results not in liberation, but in degradation, a profound sense of guilt and condemnation by the community. Herman Melville explored the limits of individualism in even more extreme and tragic terms, and emerged as a scathing critic of transcendentalism. His most powerful statement was Moby Dick, published in 1851. The story of Captain Ahab's obsessive hunt for a mysterious white whale that ends in death for Ahab and all but one member of his crew. Here, the quest for spiritual meaning in nature brings death, not transcendence, because Ahab, the liberated individual, lacks inner discipline and self-restraint. Sorry for kind of telling you what happens in Moby Dick, just kind of. It's really a good book. I encourage you reading it. Moby Dick was a commercial failure. The middle-class audience that devoured sentimental American fiction refused to follow Melville into the dark, dangerous realm of individualism gone mad. What middle-class readers emphatically preferred were the more modest examples of individualism offered by Emerson and Finney: personal improvement and religious piety through spiritual awareness and self-discipline. Okay, moving on to section 2 of chapter 11. It's entitled Rural Communalism and Urban Popular Culture. Starts on page 349. Between 1820 and 1860, thousands of Americans grew dissatisfied with life in America's emerging market society and retreated into rural areas of the Northeast and Midwest. And I would encourage you to take a look at the map 11.1 in the lower right-hand corner, page 349. There they sought to create ideal communities, or utopias, and again, that's a vocabulary term you need to know, that would allow people to live differently and realize their spiritual potential. As you define what a utopia is, then you need to provide some examples and explain how they were viewed to be utopias. Simultaneously, tens of thousands of rural Americans and European immigrants poured into the larger cities of the United States. There, they created a popular culture that challenged some sexual norms, reinforced traditional racist feelings, and encouraged new styles of dress and behavior. So let's take a look at the utopian impulse. Many rural communalists were farmers and artisans seeking refuge from the economic depression of 1837 through 1843. Others were religious idealists. Whatever their origins, these rural utopias were symbols of social protest and experimentation. By advocating the common ownership of property, which could be, actually is, what you would call socialism, and unconventional forms of marriage and family life, the communalists challenged traditional property rights and gender roles. So the first group we're going to take a look at are Mother Ann and the Shakers. The United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing, known as the Shakers because of the ecstatic dances that were part of their worship, was the first successful American communal movement. In 1770, Anne Lee Stanley, known as Mother Ann, a young cook in Manchester, England, had a vision that she was an incarnation of Christ. 4 years later, she led a few followers to America and established a church near Albany, New York. After Mother Ann's death in 1784, the Shakers honored her as the second coming of Christ, withdrew from the profane world, and formed disciplined religious communities. Members embraced the common ownership of property, accepted strict oversight by church leaders, and pledged to abstain from alcohol, tobacco, politics, and war. Shakers also repudiated sexual pleasure in marriage. Their commitment to celibacy followed Mother Ann's testimony against the lustful gratifications of the flesh as the source and foundation of human corruption. The Shakers' theology was as radical as their social thought. They held that God was a dual person, male and female. This doctrine prompted Shakers to repudiate male leadership and to place community governance in the hands of both women and men, the eldresses and the elders. Shakers founded 20 communities, mostly in New England, New York, and Ohio. Their agriculture and crafts, especially furniture making, acquired a reputation for quality that made most Shaker communities self-sustaining and even comfortable. Excuse me. Because the Shakers disdained sexual intercourse, they relied on conversions and the adoption of thousands of young orphans to increase their numbers. During the 1830s, 3,000 adults, mostly women, joined the Shakers, attracted to their communal intimacy and sexual equality. To Rebecca Cox Jackson, an African-American seamstress from Philadelphia, the Shakers seemed to be loving to live forever. However, with the proliferation of public and private orphanages during the 1840s and 1850s, Shaker communities began to decline and by 1900 had virtually disappeared. They left as a material legacy a plain but elegant style of wood furniture, which some of you may have in your dining rooms or in your kitchens at this point in time. All right, I'm going to pause to take a drink of water, just one moment. Did I tell you how cold it was at the Broncos game today? Really cold. I can still barely feel my toes. But it was fun anyway, even though we lost. All right, so moving on, we're going to take a look at Albert Brisbane and Fourierism. As the Shakers' growth slowed during the 1840s, the American Fourierist movement mushroomed. Charles Fourier, born in 1777, died in 1837, was a French reformer who devised an 8-stage theory of social evolution that predicted the imminent decline of individual property rights and capitalist values. Fourier's leading disciple in America was Albert Brisbane. Just as republicanism had freed Americans from slavish monarchical government, Brisbane argued, so Fourierist socialism would liberate workers from capitalist employers and the menial and slavish system of hired labor or labor for wages. Socialism is one of those terms or concepts that you need to define within your notes. We'll take a closer look at socialism later on in the course when we really begin to see government shift away from the capitalist economic system and move more toward a socialist system, primarily with the coming of communism. But that's many, many, many months down the road for us. Where did I leave off? Okay, so members would work for the community in cooperative groups called phalanxes. They would own its property in common, including stores and a bank, a school, and a library. Fourier in Brisbane saw the phalanx as a humane system that would liberate women as well as men. In society as it is now constituted, Brisbane wrote, individual freedom was possible only for men, while women is subjected to unremitting and slavish domestic duties. Which, if you think about Republican motherhood, that's kind of true to an extent, I guess, depending upon how you view it. In the new social order, based upon associated households, men would share women's domestic labor and thereby increase sexual equality. Brisbane skillfully promoted Fourier's ideas in his influential book, The Social Destiny of Man, published in 1840, a regular column in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, and hundreds of lectures. Fourier's ideas found a receptive audience among educated farmers and craftsmen who yearned for economic stability and communal solidarity following the Panic of 1837. During the 1840s, Fourierists started nearly 100 cooperative communities, mostly in Western New York and the Midwest. Most communities quickly collapsed as members fought over work responsibilities and social policies. Fourierism's rapid decline revealed the difficulty of maintaining a utopian community in the absence of a charismatic leader or compelling religious vision. Next, we're going to investigate John Humphrey Noyes and Oneida. And Oneida is one of those communal societies that I would really encourage you to pay a little bit of attention to. John Humphrey Noyes, born in 1811, died in 1886, was both charismatic and religious. He ascribed the Fourierist failure to their secular outlook and embraced the pious Shakers as the true pioneers of modern socialism. The Shakers' marriageless society also inspired Noyes to create a community that defined sexuality and gender roles in radically new ways. Noyes was a well-to-do graduate of Dartmouth College who joined the ministry after hearing a sermon by Charles Grandison Finney. Dismissed as the pastor of a congregational church for holding unorthodox beliefs, Noyes turned to perfectionism, and perfectionism is a term that I do want you to make sure you define within your notes. Here's just a brief description, though. Perfectionism, an evangelical Protestant movement of the 1830s that attracted thousands of New Englanders who had migrated to New York and Ohio. Perfectionists believed that Christ had already returned to earth, meaning the second coming, and therefore people could aspire to sinless perfection in their earthly lives. Unlike most perfectionists who lived conventional personal lives, Noyes rejected marriage, calling it a major barrier to perfection. Exclusiveness, jealousy, quarreling have no place at the marriage supper of the Lamb, Noyes wrote. Instead of the Shaker celibacy, Noyes embraced complex marriage, in which all members of the community were married to one another. He rejected monogamy partly to free women from their status as the property of their husbands, as they were by custom and by common law. Symbolizing the quest for equality, Noyes women followers cut their hair short and wore pantaloons under calf-length skirts. And we'll kind of see a resurgence of this in the 1920s. Obviously, this did not become mainstream with Oneida, but we will see this come about in the 1920s, and then it becomes part of pop culture. In 1839, Noyes set up a perfectionist community near his hometown of Putney, Vermont. However, local outrage over the practice of complex marriage forced Noyes to relocate the community in 1848 to an isolated area near Oneida, New York, where the members could follow his precepts. To give women the time and energy to participate fully in community affairs, Noyes urged them to avoid multiple pregnancies. He asked men to help by avoiding orgasm during intercourse. Oh my gosh, that was terribly awkward to read to you, and I'm sure it was awkward to hear, but it is what's in the book. Less positively, he encouraged sexual relations at a very early age and used his position of power to manipulate the sexual lives of his followers. If you were to do a case study of this in sociology or psychology today, you could probably deduce that Mr. Noyes was more than likely to be a pedophile. By the mid-1850s, the Oneida settlement had 200 residents and became self-sustaining when the inventor of a highly successful steel animal trap joined the community. With the profits from trap making, the Oneidians diversified into the production of silverware. Many of your parents may have Oneida flatware in their silverware drawers at this point in time. When Noyes fled to Canada in 1879 to avoid prosecution for adultery, the community abandoned complex marriage but retained its cooperative spirit. The Oneida Community Ltd., a jointly owned silverware manufacturing company, remained a successful communal venture until the middle of the 20th century. The historical significance of the Oneidians, Shakers, and Foyerists does not lie in their numbers, which were small, or in their fine crafts. Rather, it stems from their radical questioning of traditional sexual norms and the capitalist values and class divisions of the emerging market society. Their utopian communities stood as counterculture blueprints of a more egalitarian social and economic order. So now we're going to take a look at a topic that is probably you have much more knowledge about, given where we do live. We're going to take a look at Joseph Smith and the Mormon experience. The Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were religious utopians with a conservative social agenda to perpetuate close-knit communities and patriarchal power. Because of their cohesiveness, authoritarian leadership, and size, the Mormons provoked more animosity than the radical utopians did. Like many social movements of the era, Mormonism, and again, that's a concept you need to make sure that you go into detail in your notes for. Mormonism emerged from religious ferment among families of Puritan descent who lived along the Erie Canal and who were heirs to a religious tradition that believed in a world of wonders, supernatural powers, and visions of the divine. And again, this is coming from the perspective of the authors. I don't know how accurate this would be according to elders within the Mormon Church. So just keep in mind, it's the perspective of the authors who are Utah-based. The book is published out of Utah and so forth. Continuing on page 353, the founder of the Latter-day Church, Joseph Smith Jr., born in 1805, died in 1844, was born in Vermont to a poor farming and shopkeeping family that migrated to Palmyra in central New York. In 1820, Smith began to have religious experiences similar to those described in conversion narratives during the Puritan time period. Quote, "A pillar of light above the brightness of the sun at noonday came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God," end quote. Smith came to believe that God had singled him out to receive a special revelation of divine truth. In 1830, he published the Book of Mormon, which he claimed to have translated from ancient hieroglyphics on gold plates shown to him by an angel named Moroni. The Book of Mormon told the story of an ancient Jewish civilization from the Middle East that had migrated to the Western Hemisphere, and of the visit of Jesus Christ, soon after his resurrection, to those descendants of Israel. Smith's account explained the presence of native peoples in the Americas and integrated them into the Judeo-Christian tradition. Smith proceeded to organize the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Seeing himself as a prophet in a sinful, excessively individualistic society, Smith revived traditional social doctrines, including patriarchal authority. Like many Protestant ministers, he encouraged practices that led to individual success in the age of capitalist markets and factories. Those would include frugality, hard work, and enterprise. Smith also stressed communal discipline to safeguard the Mormon New Jerusalem. His goal was a church-directed society that would restore primitive Christianity and encourage moral perfectionism. Constantly harassed by anti-Mormons, Smith struggled to find a secure home for his new religion. At one point, he identified Jackson County in Missouri as the site of the sacred city of Zion, and his followers began to settle there. Agitation led by Protestant ministers quickly forced them out. Quote, "Mormons were the common enemies of mankind and ought to be destroyed," end quote, said one cleric. Smith and his growing congregation eventually settled in Nauvoo, Illinois, a town they founded on the Mississippi River. And you can see that on the map 11.2 at the bottom of page 353. By the early 1840s, Nauvoo had 30,000 residents. The Mormons' rigid discipline and secret rituals, along with their prosperity, hostility toward other sects, and block voting in Illinois elections, fueled resentment among their neighbors. That resentment increased when Smith refused to accept Illinois laws of which he disapproved, asked Congress to make Nauvoo a separate federal territory, and declared himself a candidate for President of the United States. Moreover, Smith claimed to have received a new revelation justifying polygamy, the practice of a man having multiple wives. When leading Mormon men took several wives, plural celestial marriage, they threw the Mormon community into turmoil and enraged nearby Christians. In 1844, Illinois officials arrested Smith and charged him with treason for allegedly conspiring to create a Mormon colony in Mexican territory. An anti-Mormon mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, where Smith and his brother were being held, and murdered them. Brigham Young and Utah. Led by Brigham Young, Smith's leading disciple and now the sect's prophet, seer, and revelator, about 6,500 Mormons fled the United States. Beginning in 1846, they crossed the Great Plains into Mexican territory and settled in the Great Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah. Using cooperative labor and an irrigation system based on communal water rights, the Mormon pioneers quickly spread agricultural communities along the base of the Wasatch Range. Many Mormons who rejected polygamy remained in the United States. Led by Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, they formed the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and settled throughout the Midwest. When the United States acquired Mexico's northern territories in 1848, the Salt Lake Mormons petitioned Congress to create a vast new state, Deseret, stretching from Utah to the Pacific coast. Instead, Congress set up the much smaller Utah Territory in 1850 and named Brigham Young its governor. Young and his associates ruled in an authoritarian fashion, determined to ensure the ascendancy of the Mormon Church and its practices. By 1856, Young and the Utah Territorial Legislature were openly vowing to resist federal laws. Pressed by Protestant church leaders to end polygamy and considering the Mormons' threat of nullification and declaration of war, President James Buchanan dispatched a small army to Utah. As the Nauvoo Legion resisted the army's advance, aggressive Mormon militia massacred a party of 120 California-bound immigrants and murdered suspicious travelers and Mormons seeking to flee Young's regime. Despite this bloodshed, the so-called Mormon War ended quietly in June 1858. President Buchanan, a longtime supporter of the White South, feared that the forced abolition of polygamy would serve as a precedent for ending slavery and offered a pardon to Utah citizens who would acknowledge federal authority. And that's something I want you to keep in mind as we trek into the abolitionist movement. To enable Utah to win admission to the Union in 1896, its citizens ratified a constitution that forever banned the practice of polygamy. However, the state government has never strictly enforced that ban, as there are some communal societies located kind of straddling the border in the Four Corners region, in which there are polygamist families living there. The Salt Lake Mormons had succeeded even as other social experiments had failed. Reaffirming traditional values, their leaders resolutely used strict religious controls to perpetuate patriarchy and communal discipline. However, by endorsing private property and individual enterprise, Mormons became prosperous contributors to the New Market Society. This blend of economic innovation, social conservatism, and hierarchical leadership, in combination with a strong missionary impulse, created a wealthy and expansive church that now claims a worldwide membership of about 12 million people. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We will pick up on page 354, looking at urban popular culture in the next installment of Skank the Tank's broadcast for Chapter 11 in AP US History.